What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Poland Pro trimmer, and the problem is that it was running just fine, but it started to lose power and eventually it stopped. After that, it wouldn't start again. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this trimmer. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So we do have some history on this trimmer that might help us out. I was told they replaced the fuel lines since they were old and cracked, and that it did run after replacing them. However, they didn't use it after replacing the lines, and it sat in the garage ever since. Very recently, it was taken out of the garage to be used, and it worked well, but within a few minutes it began to slow down, and soon after stopped working. The first thought it was a carburetor problem, of course, as it seemed to slow down as if it was running out of fuel, but before we tear into it, let's take a good look around. The first thing that's very obvious is that the fuel lines are ran very poorly around the carburetor. Now this wouldn't cause our problem, but we'll have to reroute them later on to avoid the throttle from sticking wide open. The next thing is to remove the fuel cap and examine the fuel left in the tank. If there's water in the tank, it's made its way to the filter, that would definitely cause our problem. It's at this point where we find our first problem. Whoever ran the new fuel lines didn't install a fuel filter. Now on initial startup, this wouldn't stop the engine, but as more unfiltered fuel enters the carburetor, the inlet screen will clog up and starve the engine of fuel, causing it to stop running. So the plan to fix this trimmer is to remove the carburetor and open it up and clean out the inlet screen, which is going to be clogged, and then reroute the fuel lines and install a new fuel filter. Now we already know this engine runs, so I don't think the metering diaphragm will need to be replaced, but we will examine it just to make sure. This filter base also has one extra screw due to the way the carb is designed, so don't forget to remove it. We can now remove the filter base, but the fuel lines and the throttle cable keep us from removing it completely. We'll just have to remove the fuel lines from the carburetor to the primer bulb and also the throttle cable. Now be sure to either mark the lines or take good pictures to help put the fuel lines back to where they belong later on. The carburetor is rather interesting as it has a two-stage throttle plate design. There's an additional inlet boot and plate that will need to be removed just to get to the carburetor. After taking the bolts out, carefully remove it and maneuver it off the linkage. So once the plate is off, we can now remove the bolt on top of the carburetor to get to the pumping diaphragm, and of course the inlet screen, which should be clogged up with dirt. If it is, we'll remove as much as we can, then use some carburetor cleaner to finish cleaning it. There's not that much dirt, but it's enough to keep the engine from running. Now that the screen is clean, let's take a good look at the metering diaphragm so we can check it and make sure it's working like it's supposed to. It should be very flexible and without any wrinkles. Well, it looks like it's in great shape. If it showed any signs of hardening or wrinkles, I would suggest replacing the diaphragm. And if you're uncomfortable doing that, then just buy a replacement carburetor. Now that everything looks okay, let's put the whole thing back together. Another reason why your trimmer might have stopped running and will not start again is if there's straight gas in the fuel tank instead of mixed gas. If that's the case, then the engine will slowly lose power, eventually losing engine compression, and after that, it's not likely to ever start again. Now, if you tried cleaning your carburetor and still not running correctly, then try once more and take more time. If it still isn't running right, then definitely consider a new carburetor. Sometimes the passages are just too difficult to clean. Now, when installing the inlet plate, make sure you reconnect the linkage first and then install the plate to the carburetor. If you install the plate first, it'll be very difficult to connect the linkage. After the plate was installed, I didn't remember which way the reddish colored boot was supposed to be placed, but it is rotated the other direction, and by the time I get it installed on the engine, it is the correct way. Now, I can't say why the fuel filter wasn't installed when they replaced the fuel lines, but there's just no excuse for it when they're so affordable. After installing the filter, make sure there's enough line in the tank so the filter sits at the very bottom of the tank. Now, if you didn't take any pictures to help remind you where the fuel lines went, I'll let you know that the line with the filter goes to the port towards the front of the engine. Now, I didn't remove the other line on the carburetor, that way I didn't have to remember that this line went to the shorter port on the primer bulb. Now, since the throttle cable and the fuel lines are connected to the filter base, installing it can be pretty complicated, so take your time so you don't pinch any of the fuel lines. Now, this has got to be the most complicated carburetor installation next to a Troy-Bilt or a Craftsman 4-cycle trimmer. It just shouldn't be this complicated to install a carburetor on an engine. And if you own this model and you need to service it, well, I would suggest taking it into someone else so they can do it. Working on this one can be very tedious and very frustrating. Once the carburetor is back on the engine, let's put some fuel into the tank and try starting it up. Now, there's a good chance the carburetor is going to need a slight adjustment due to the fact it's been in storage for a while, and of course the fuel filter is missing off the line. The engine seems to be running just a little too fast, so I'll turn down the idle adjustment screw a few times until the trimmer head stops spinning. Now, if it's still running too fast, I'll adjust it while it's running next time. Whoever had this trimmer before must have had an idling problem, so they turned down the idle screw all the way so it wouldn't have to idle anymore. Now, I won't use this trimmer very often, only because it's just too heavy, but I do have some areas in the woods that this would be perfect for. If you want to use this trimmer every day, well, that's your choice. Now, my question to you is, have you ever tried to troubleshoot your trimmer by removing the fuel filter out of the tank? Maybe you thought there was restriction there and wanted to test it by running without it. I know what I've done in the past, but I'm more curious about your answer. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.